Hey, 10th grade. So, this is your video for your Act 1 for our town. And if you see me looking down, I'm looking at my book because I'm going to read different things to you. So, first off, we talked about in class that when you go and you see a play at the Orpheum, whatever, I just saw Aladdin, and it's extravagant, it's brightly colored, there are moving parts. My favorite play is Phantom of the Opera, and one of my favorite things that they did with the newer set is when they're walking down, like literally steps appear out of this building, and it turns, and all the costumes are elaborate and everything like that. And then I'm hoping when you started Act 1 and you were in the italics, you noticed there's hardly anything. It says no curtain, no scenery. And literally, as you're arriving in the audience, your stage manager, and you notice he's pretty pivotal, is setting up your stage, like in front of you. Okay? So, first, with that should strike you as odd. And even when they do have bits and pieces of scenery, as he calls it, there's hardly anything. You've got on here some benches at the corners of the stage. You've got some trellises that eventually make their way, but there's some table and chairs on each side. So there's hardly anything. Okay. So the reason for that, and you'll notice a lot in here that they pantomime the things they're doing, whether it's the newspaper boy throwing papers, Doc Gibbs carrying his medicine bag, petting the horse, the milk bottles, and all of that. All of it is pantomime for the most part, opening and shutting the oven, etc. So there's a reason. So I'm going to start with the title, and it's called Our Town, not my town, not your town, but our town. So the reason the scenery is hardly there, and the reason everything is pantomimed, is because your author wants you to be able to make this your town, and I can make it my town, and Sally can make it her town, and he can make it, Paul can make it his town. So everything is suggestive, so you can imagine the town as you would see it. And it makes you, your reader, or your audience, relate to the town in their own way. So that's one main reason why this play is considered one of the greatest plays of all time, of American plays, is because of that fact. It's written so you can put yourself in the play and you can relate to it in your own ways. That's why it's called Our Town. Okay? So, you start off with your stage manager. He talks a lot. And he's written as a modern version of the Greek chorus / choragus. So in old school Greek drama, in between the acts, you would have a chorus come on. And basically the chorus is there to summarize things. Think about when you read a novel, all that information in between the dialogue. That's what they're there for. And that the choragus, out of your Greek chorus, he steps forward and he's the one that has the main speaking part. So that's what your stage manager represents. He's a modern version of that. So he's there, like if you're reading a novel, he's there to be the in-between parts between your dialogue. That's what he's there for, okay? So you notice it starts off and put like Mrs. C, D, and the reason for that is you can put anybody's name in there. And it starts off with a morning scene. And this Act 1 is called Daily Life. So it is giving you a picture of what daily life is like in Grover's Corners, okay? So it describes for you just a normal town, and it talks about Main Street. There's the railway station. There's groups of people, you'll notice, that live across the tracks, and you can sit there and apply that to your own town. Think about Memphis and how many different bits and places where groups of people live here, the Hispanic community here. There are all different nooks and crannies in Memphis. It's kind of the same idea. It has all the different churches, your post office, your town hall, the government. everything is extremely generic, and that's on purpose. So you can apply your own thought processes to what this town looks like. Okay? It gives you prominent families. Every town has a prominent family. I mean, think about Memphis and FedEx. I mean, Fred Smith is kind of prominent. Everybody knows who he is in our town. And then it goes through the schools over there, the drugstores over here, and then you have the introduction of your two families. They parallel one another. That's why the stage is set up the way it is. One family on one side, the other family on the other, and their houses are set up exactly the same. Gardens, the trellises, the tables for breakfast, etc. So you go through here and it talks about the names in the town, that they haven't changed very often. And it's the idea of, a lot of times, especially in small towns, you know everyone, and not a lot of people leave. They stay there because their family's there. And it goes through and it talks about the train whistle and the time. So one big theme in this play, you have several, okay, is time. And there's the old adage about how fast time flies. And that adage is so important to this play, because you'll notice in here, everything's by time, but it's almost like they're speeding up everything and they're not paying attention to the small things. And I'll point that out as we go through the act. So you're introduced to the different women of the families. Miss Gibbs, she's plump and pleasant, in mid-30s. She comes downstairs, and then you have this section where all of a sudden your stage manager jumps ahead after the play and talks about Doc Gibbs dying, and they name the hospital after him. And you have Mrs. Gibbs dying of pneumonia. And so remember, he's going to sit there and give you the extra information that's seen outside of the play. That's what a Greek chorus does. And in there, you'll see on your questions, it talks about, why is it ironic that Mrs. Gibbs dies of pneumonia? And you'll notice throughout all three acts, she's always the one that's most worried about somebody getting sick, needing rest, etc., etc. And eventually she's the one that gets sick and dies. So we go through and we see Mrs. Webb coming downstairs. She's more serious. She's thin. And we have Joe Crowell delivering the papers, and he's 11. And you're going to see a lot of conversations that we have all of the time, just in the play version. So they talk about the weather and just normal things like somebody's getting married today. And just thinking to yourself, how many times have you gone up to someone and like, how are you doing? And you have that generic conversation of, how are you? Oh, it's a nice day out today. And that's what you see here. Generic conversations that you could sit there and think, oh, I remember when I talked to so-and-so like that. And Joe Crowell is that. And you also see in there, all of a sudden, stage manager interrupts and he says, Joe was awful bright, graduated from high school here, head of his class, got a scholarship, graduated head of his class there, was going to be a great engineer, but war broke out and died in France. Okay? So the idea of all this time and effort put into something, and it doesn't always add up to what they anticipated it to be. So you're going to see bits and pieces like Joe Crowell, and you see the bits and pieces about Mr. and Mrs. Gibbs dying. They're going to be short little snippets in there, because this play as a whole doesn't have anything in there that's extremely tragic and outlandish happening. But think about it. We see it on the news all the time, people dying in war, soldiers not coming home, somebody dying of pneumonia. Think about what's happening now. And these are things that happen to all of us. We've all had or know of somebody that's died in some type of way, whether it's a sickness, whether it's from war, whether it's from a car accident. We can all plug those bits and pieces of tragedy in our lives. And this isn't the main focus of the play, but it shows you that in their daily lives, in their town, which is also, okay, they go through the exact same things that we do, these individual tragedies in different families. So Then you meet Howie Newsom, the milkman. Think old school milkman. He's supposed to sound country because he owns a farm. And you see their conversation again. Oh, it's nice outside. Generic conversation. And then you get to meet the families. So in here, you have it bouncing back and forth. Webbs, Gibbs, Webbs, Gibbs. So you got to make sure you know whose children go, like the children, who does Rebecca go with, which family, etc. Okay, so the Gibbs family, you have George, and then the Webb family, you have Rebecca. They're the same age, and then you have them going back and forth in the morning trying to get them up. Can you think of how many times your parents had to get you up in the morning? Like, my alarm clock was always the dogs. The dogs were always let in my room, so that's what always woke me up. But think about when you were younger, or even now. Sometimes your parents might get you up, okay, and the chaos that can be the morning. Okay, trying to get everybody dressed, trying to get everybody out the door, trying to get everybody breakfast, and then if you've had a sibling and if you've ever had to share a bathroom, throwing soap at each other, and if you don't stop, then I'm coming up there and making you stop, kind of thing. And it has all of that, okay? And you have, I was bad about this. I was not a breakfast eater in school. And you have the moms trying to make their kids slow down to just have a breakfast. And, they're always such in a rush. Oh, mom, I got to get here. I'm going to be late. I got to go do this. I got to go do that. And we're all guilty of that. And so you see the children rush out, their friends, obviously, their neighbors, and go to school together. Okay? And then you have our conversation next between Mrs. Webb and Mrs. Gibbs out there feeding the chicks. Conversation, just generic, oh, I'm feeling a little better kind of thing. And putting up food and like think about, I got to go to the grocery store for this dinner. And then it talks about that this random man came by, and Miss Gibbs says he was going to give $350 to them for this high boy, which is like a furniture piece. You might have it in your dining room. It's where people display china and things like that. It has drawers on the bottom and like glass doors you can open on the top. It's kind of that idea. And Mrs. Gibbs didn't know if she would sell it. But if she does, there's a particular thing she wants to do with it, which is travel and go see the world in Paris. Okay? And think about that. Would your family like to do that? Are there places in the world you'd love to go? It's that same idea. They want to get out of their town and see what else God created in the world. Okay? And you'll see that they, as a family, aren't necessarily poor. They're not necessarily rich, but they're a family that's smack dab in the middle. And they can make ends meet, but they have to work to make them meet. And he does that on purpose because most people can identify with having to work to make ends meet, but getting along with what you have. So they go through and talk about seeing Paris. And you see in there that Mrs. Gibbs doesn't know if her husband will want to go because they take their trips to battlefields and things like that. But for her, it's all about seeing somewhere else, something that's exotic. I mean, going around and visiting Shiloh is interesting, but wouldn't it be more interesting to go to Spain and see what that's like? It's kind of that same feeling. So they're all eventually brushed off the stage by the stage manager. You notice he keeps keeps the time, okay? And then you have this random section with Professor Willard who tells you generic on purpose, things about the town. That way it can be any town. And you also have this random section with Mr. Webb, and he's talking to people in the audience. So if you went and saw this play, there would be people strategically placed in the audience that are a part of the play. So this is another reason why this play was considered so famous and unlike all the others, because this play is written so that the audience can be a part of it. It's not meant and it's not written for the audience to be lost in the story. It's meant for the audience to be a part of the story and make it their own. So you have all of these people ask different questions, whether there's alcohol or much drinking. And he says, not necessarily a ton of that. There's one man that talks about social injustice and industrial inequality, the idea that there are people or groups of people that aren't treated fairly. And that can be, think about Memphis. Alone, the disparity in the social classes is there. You can see that across America. And then it talks about culture and love of beauty. And here it says there's not for culture. And this is where Memphis is a little different. We were like, well, Memphis has got some culture. There's a lot of different cultures represented in Memphis, but here they attribute culture to the arts, and that people don't necessarily have a ton of culture except for loving the outdoors, what's beautiful outside. Every city can somehow relate to that. And then different bits and pieces of literature like the Bible and things like that. So we skip ahead, and it's the afternoon and the kids are coming home. So you see Emily walking like she's a diva, basically, a lady of elegance. So think diva. And they tell her to walk simply, and you can kind of see the father-daughter relationship, which in a lot of families is very important. And then you see George coming down the street, and he's pantomiming. His favorite thing is baseball, because remember, that's all he's been totally absorbed with baseball, and he's not doing his chores he normally does. So he's throwing up the ball, pop flies, and running into people. And he has a conversation with Emily. And you can already see where this is going with their conversation. So they talk about her speech in class. You can tell Emily does quite well in school. And then you have George, who school isn't for him. He goes because he has to, but his interest is becoming what? A farmer. And that's what he longs to do. So he says since he's not so good at school that maybe Emily can give him some kind of hints, which is basically opening the door for him to talk to her whenever he wants. You see where that's going. So George leaves, he says goodbye, and Mrs. Webb is like, wow, he's really maturing. He's actually starting to have conversations with people. And then you have Emily talk to her mother. And she talks about being really good in school, generic conversation. Think about it. When you come home to your parents, are like, how was school today? What'd you do? And then she changes and she asks the question, Mama, am I good looking? And, that's not a coincidence happening after talking. She's having this conversation after talking to George. This is on purpose. And for us, we know she's asking that because she wants to know if her mother thinks she's beautiful enough to get anyone or to have someone interested in her, which we know she's talking about George. But her mother, you see conversations like, yeah, you're pretty. I told you, you have nice eyes. Like, why are you fishing? Like, why are we having this conversation? And it's the same conversation eventually as girls get older. That girls all want to hear that they're beautiful. And she's looking for that for her mother. But you'll notice in all three acts, there are things that are tough conversations that parents have to have with their kids. And you see that the parents in here don't always have those conversations, or the society or the city as a whole, the different people in it don't want to address the difficult things. And we'll talk more about that. Okay? So the conversation between Emily and her mother ends not necessarily with her mother saying exactly what she wants her to. She says, you're pretty enough for all normal purposes, which isn't what Emily wants to hear. She wants to hear she's beautiful so she can feel confident when she talks to George again. And They both leave. Stage manager interrupts. Again, gotta keep on time, rush it through. And it goes through, and he has this long conversation about the Cartwrights' prominent family, just like we have here, and they built a bank, and then they put this time capsule in there in the cornerstone, and it lists several things in there that they have inside the time capsule. They're all on purpose. So New York Times gives you a picture of the New York Times, if you read it now, depicts what's going on in several different places across the U.S. And the Sentinel, okay, Mr. Webb, he's the editor of the Sentinel, and so that gives you a picture of what's happening during that time period, the big things happening in Grover's Corners. And then we have the Bible put in there, and the Constitution, all prevalent foundational pieces of texts. And you have Shakespeare's plays, which is considered the height of drama. And then it goes through and it says, all of these things are great. I mean, think about it. We just read Julius Caesar. They're great. And if you read through any of Shakespeare's works, I mean, they have influenced everybody's reading and influenced culture. But if you go through and you read them, they're all about prominent people. There's nothing written about the day-to-day, hint, Act 1, daily life of the people that make up the society. I mean, think about Julius Caesar. I mean, the common people are in there and they're depicted as dumb and ignorant and fickle, and that's about all you know about the common people in Julius Caesar's day. That's not how they all were. It doesn't let you know anything about the general society. So that's why it says at the end there that they put a copy of Our Town in there so people would know what their daily life and routine was like all of the time. You notice I said routine, because that's what daily life, this act is all about. What is their daily routine like? Okay? That should stick out to you. I mean, think about it. In our last week and a half, our daily routine has changed dramatically. I mean, you all know I'm very type A, and so I love a routine, and I'm struggling and trying to learn how to make a new routine for what we're doing now. And that's what Act 1 they get up in the morning, the newspaper boy comes by, they get their milk, they have their breakfast, they go to school, and then they come home. I mean, that's what it is, okay? You have Mr. Webb do the newspaper, Doc Gibbs he's the doctor. He sees people all day. The women stay at home. They cook. They take care of the garden, the house. That's their routine. And so he puts this play in there so people will know what people in Grover's Corners were like, what their routine was like, their daily habits, because that's what makes up Grover's Corners. Yeah, you have your Cartwrights who are pivotal, well known in the society, but that's not who makes up Grover's Corners. It's the individuals. And that's why they put Our Town in there, is so people will know what their daily lives were like. Okay? Now, it goes through, and after it talks about the time capsule, it says, a choir partially concealed in the orchestra pit has begun singing, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. Okay, this song is introduced in every single act. Okay? And if you think about it, look this song up. Okay? And I'm going to discuss it in great detail when we get to the end. But if you look the song up and you look up why it was written, it's why it was chosen. Okay? So I'm going to throw that out there. You don't have to know that yet. I'm going to talk about it once it's presented in all three acts. But the song is chosen on purpose, and it is played at or mentioned in the play as specific parts on purpose. Okay? So we have the choir practicing Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. You have the scenery change a little bit with the ladder, so it suggests that another floor of the house. And you get to meet Simon Stimson, the choir director. So it jumps back and forth from the choir practicing to Emily and George. Song, Emily and George, their first little meeting out the window, where he needs help and wants hints with his homework. Yeah, homework. He just wants to talk to her. Okay. So that's on purpose. That song, and the first time they're kind of talking outside of the norm of walking to school and when they come home outside. Okay. Just throwing that out there. Okay. And then it jumps from their conversation. They say goodnight. Simon Stimson is still directing the choir off in the distance. So if you were watching this play, you would hear them practicing, but you wouldn't necessarily see everything. Okay. So then you have Dr. Gibbs have a conversation with George. And we've all had this conversation at some point. And Dr. Gibbs talks to George about what he wants to be when he gets older and being a farmer. And there's a reason for that, because if you know anything about farming, you got to be on top of your game. You got to get up early. You got to get your stuff done. Otherwise, you are not a farmer. You have to take care of your business and your chores. And the reason he's saying that is because at home, has George been doing his chores? Not so much. He's been so worried about baseball that he's not doing the things that he's supposed to do to help his mother, like chop wood. And Doc Gibbs brings that up and says, you do those things because you love your mother. If you don't do those things, and it says, there you see your mother getting up early, cooking meals all day long, washing and ironing, and still she has to go out in the back and chop wood. I suppose she got tired of asking you. She just gave up and thought it was easier to do it herself. But you eat her meals, you put on the clothes that she washes for you, you run off and play baseball, and you're treating her, although not intentionally, you're treating her like some hired help, not your mother. And of course, when he says that, George is crying. He hands him the handkerchief, and he raises his allowance. His allowance is 25 cents. He gets 25 cents more. And because he's getting older, hinting that dating is coming. Okay. And it talks about their mother coming home, or George's mother coming home from choir. So George goes back upstairs, and then we swap to the ladies. You know what ladies do when they get together? They gossip. Okay, so this, again, generic. Okay, and you have them talk. You have Mrs. Gibbs and Mrs. Webb in the choir with Mrs. Solms walking home, and she's your general lady in the town. That's what she represents. And they're gossiping. And it's the worst scandal that ever was in this town. And it is Simon. And it says that they all know that he drinks and he has a problem and he's an alcoholic. Okay. So, individuals that are alcoholics, okay, we know that it stems from some kind of issue. Anybody going to do anything about it? It says Dr. Ferguson keeps him on there in his job, and the only thing the rest of us can do is just not notice it. When people have issues like that can literally harm themselves or others, should we ignore it and not notice it? Like, your brain should be saying, no, no, no. But you'll see that in here, those things that are tough, like seeing an individual literally drowning themselves, people are like, that's not my business. I'm going to let them handle it. We're going to talk about it because it's a small town. We're going to talk about that, okay? But we're not going to help because that gets us out of our comfort zones, and that's not for us. We're not supposed to. No, that's not my problem. It's his problem, okay? So they're walking home. There's a huge moon out. The ladies are a little late because of the gossiping going on. And again, Mrs. Gibbs talks about Simon Stimson, and Dr. Gibbs already knows about it, okay? But there's nothing we can do but just leave it alone. Not going to mess with that. It's not my problem, okay? And then the irony. Mrs. Gibbs says, I think it's my duty to make sure you rest so you don't get sick, which eventually she does. And then, of course, they argue and banter back and forth because he's supposed to be sarcastic and playful. And they talk about locking doors and how people are doing that in other places and maybe they should do it there. That old school small town feel is what that's supposed to represent. So George gets upstairs, or he is upstairs, and his sister comes up, Rebecca, and they're looking out the window and they're talking about this moon. And this is kind of how this act ends. And there's this beautiful moon, and Rebecca says, George, is the moon shining on South America, Canada, and half the whole world? And sometimes when you think about when you're in a small town, and a lot of times these individuals that live in small towns, and it says that in there, they don't necessarily leave. And if they do leave, they come back because it's all they know. And if you've never left, it's hard to imagine that me, little Sally Sue, in this small town, I'm underneath the same sky that Fred Smith, the millionaire, or whoever you want to put in there, somebody of pivotal importance. We look at the same moon. Like, we breathe the same air. And for her, it's hard for her little self, Rebecca, to imagine one big moon for everyone because she's never been anywhere else. Okay? Then we have the stage manager. He kind of interrupts all the time. Okay? And he says 9:30, most lights are out by this time. Remember, daily life, routine. And then you have the Constable Warren, old school constable walking the street, okay? Old school police beat, okay? And he's going through and checking the doors and things like that. And the constable talks to Mr. Webb, okay? Who's walking home from working on the newspaper. So, again, they bring up Simon. You know, if they keep bringing this up, it's foreshadowing something later on. Just saying. And they all know his problem, that he drinks, and that this has been an issue. But just like they say, they all look the other way. It's none of their business, although they all talk about him like it is. But they're not willing to step in and have the hard conversation to help. So they have this little statement in there that says, or Constable Warren says, I don't know how that's going to end, Mr. Webb. And Mr. Webb responds, well, he's seen a peck of trouble, one thing after another. So that gives you a hint as a reader that the reason he drinks is because there's something going on inside of him. And you'll see a lot of times those that are alcoholic have something that they are trying to hide, and that they're trying to forget something. And you can see that this is the same thing with Simon Simpson. He's been through some tough stuff, and he drinks to self-medicate, but no one is willing to step in and help him deal with it. Okay? So he leaves Constable Warren, and Mr. Webb gets home, and he's talking. Emily's still up because it's so beautiful outside. The moon is so big. You had this as one of your questions, how you can tell she's a romantic. She's up staring at the sky and the stars. She's smelling the beautiful flowers that are outside. And that's where you can kind of see the hint of the romantic that's in her. And then it ends with Rebecca talking about this random letter. Okay? I never told you about this letter, and it goes from literally the specific person it's supposed to go to this idea from the earth, the solar system, the universe, the mind of God. And it's literally going from the smallest, the tiniest detail to this overall, think about God watching over us all, and that we're just a tiny, tiny little speck. And she can't imagine how this letter still got there. You go from mind of God to Jane. Like, is she that important? How did they get the letter to her with all of those other things on there? Okay, so hold on to that thought because I'm going to bring it back as we read more. But that idea of the small, tiny things, I mean, think about it. This is daily life. Our daily life is made up of small, seemingly insignificant things. Think about what your daily routine, your daily life was like 3 weeks ago. Think about what it's like now. Very different. Has it thrown you off some? You see what I'm saying? I'll tell you what, I long for the day where we can get back and just be in our routine and you're in my class. I can get up in the morning like I always do, get ready for the classes, and know you're coming to see me 5th period. Okay? And that's what I long to get back to our daily life. And that's what Rebecca is saying is there are these small, minute pieces of the overall idea of our world and God looking down on us. And sometimes we forget about how important the little things are. I mean, sometimes it's hard for us to imagine that this big God that looks over everything knows who we are. And he knows how many strands of hair we have on our head. He knew us. He knew our names before we were born. And he knows everything about us. Sometimes it's hard to link those two things together and feel like we're that important. And that's kind of where Rebecca is. Those small little things, we are important. And that right there, the small little things being important, is a huge theme for this play as you read along. Okay? Because that's what daily life, that's what it's given you. The small, mundane tasks that they do every single day. Get up, eat, paper, breakfast, school, etc., going to church, that type of thing. So keep that idea, daily routine, small tasks, small things that are insignificant to us a lot of times. Think about that and keep that in mind as we go through the next couple of acts. Again, you know how I like to discuss. So if you've got some questions, don't hesitate to contact me. See y'all later.